Here is a thought experiment. Imagine two people. The first is a middle-aged man sitting in a courtroom, being sentenced for a violent crime. The judge looks down at him with barely concealed contempt and says, with the full weight of moral authority, that this man made his choices, that he knew right from wrong, and that now he must face the consequences of his freely chosen actions. The second person is a middle-aged man sitting in a hospital bed, being told by his cardiologist that decades of chronic stress, poor nutrition, and genetic predisposition have resulted in severe coronary artery disease. The cardiologist does not look at him with contempt. The cardiologist does not tell him he deserves his blocked arteries. The cardiologist says, let's figure out what happened and what we can do about it. Same species, same brain, same biology. Completely different responses from society depending on which organ decided to malfunction. Nobody finds this inconsistency strange, and that, more than almost anything else, tells you how deeply and unexaminedly we have committed to a particular story about human behavior, a story that the neuroscience, the biology, and the evolutionary research have been quietly dismantling for decades. The story is this, that human beings are fundamentally free agents whose actions flow from sovereign conscious choice, and that this freedom is what makes blame, punishment, and moral condemnation not just understandable, but righteous. Today we are going to look at what happens when you take that story seriously enough to actually test it against the evidence. And then we are going to ask a question that makes a lot of people deeply uncomfortable. If the story is wrong, if determinism is not a philosophical curiosity but a biological reality, what does compassion look like in a world without free will? And more importantly, is that world actually worse than the one we currently inhabit? Or is it, against all intuition, considerably better? Let's start with the biology, because that is always where we should start. Every human behavior, every act of kindness, every explosion of rage, every moment of moral courage, every failure of self-control, is produced by a brain. This is not a controversial statement. Everyone agrees with it in the abstract. The controversy begins when you follow that statement to its logical conclusion, which is that the brain producing the behavior was itself produced by something, and that something was produced by something else, and that something else was produced by something else. And if you follow that chain backward with sufficient rigor, you never arrive at a point where a freely choosing self stepped in from outside the causal order and started making genuinely uncaused decisions. The brain you are using right now to evaluate this argument was shaped by your genome. Your genome was the product of the specific sperm and egg that happened to meet at the moment of your conception, which was itself the product of an evolutionary history stretching back 4 billion years. The brain you are using was then further shaped by everything that happened to it during development, the hormonal environment of the womb, the nutrition available in early childhood, the stress levels of your caregivers, the neighborhood you grew up in, the school you attended, the language you absorbed before you could critically evaluate it, the 10,000 experiences that left their marks in synaptic architecture before you were old enough to have preferences about what was shaping you. None of that was chosen, not one element of it, and all of it is sitting inside every decision you make, every thought you have, every impulse you feel rising, and every impulse you manage to suppress. Now, here is where the prefrontal cortex enters the story, because it always does. The prefrontal cortex is the brain region most closely associated with what we might call the better angels of our nature: impulse regulation, long-term thinking, empathy, moral reasoning, the ability to override a reactive emotional response with a more considered one. When your amygdala fires in response to a perceived threat, and your body floods with cortisol and adrenaline, and every ancient circuit in your nervous system is screaming at you to attack or flee, it is largely your prefrontal cortex that steps in and says, hold on, let's think about this for a moment. This is the biological substrate of what people call self-control. And self-control, in our cultural narrative, is the thing that separates the people who deserve our compassion from the people who deserve our condemnation. People who exercise it are moral. People who fail to exercise it are weak, or bad, or criminal. But here is what we actually know about the prefrontal cortex. It is the last part of the brain to develop, reaching full maturity somewhere around age 25. It is exquisitely sensitive to stress. Chronic stress measurably reduces prefrontal gray matter density and impairs the synaptic connections between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, weakening exactly the regulatory circuitry that self-control depends on. It is sensitive to sleep deprivation, to poor nutrition, to environmental toxins, to early childhood adversity, to the glucocorticoid damage that accumulates over years of living under conditions of scarcity and threat. A person who grew up in poverty, experienced childhood trauma, was exposed to lead in their environment, and has been living under chronic stress for 20 years does not have the same prefrontal architecture as a person who grew up in safety, stability, and abundance. They do not have the same biological capacity for the self-regulation we are about to hold them equally accountable for failing to demonstrate. This is not an excuse, this is a measurement, and the distinction between those two things matters enormously. Think about what we mean when we say something is an excuse. An excuse implies that there is a real underlying responsibility being evaded that the person actually could have done otherwise but is offering a reason why we should overlook their failure to do so. But if the neuroscience is correct, if behavior is the product of biological systems shaped by factors outside the person's control, then there is no underlying responsibility being evaded. There is simply causation being described. The person who failed to regulate their behavior because their prefrontal cortex was compromised by childhood adversity and chronic stress is not making an excuse. They are providing a causal account. The fact that the causal account is uncomfortable does not make it an excuse. It makes it true. And here is where determinism and compassion begin to converge. Because once you actually follow the causal chain rather than stopping conveniently at the surface of the behavior and declaring free choice, something interesting happens to your emotional response. It becomes very hard to maintain contempt. This has been tested. Researchers have shown that when people are given detailed biological and developmental information about individuals who have committed harmful acts, information about childhood trauma, neurological damage, genetic vulnerabilities, their desire for punitive retributive responses decreases significantly. Not because they stop caring about the harm caused, not because they decide the behavior was acceptable, but because the information disrupts the narrative of sovereign free choice that punitive responses depend on. When you understand the causal machinery, punishment as retribution starts to feel like what it actually is, making a damaged system suffer for being damaged. This does not mean doing nothing. This is the part of the argument where people usually panic, and it is worth addressing directly. Accepting determinism does not mean accepting that harmful behavior should have no consequences, or that dangerous people should be allowed to continue causing harm, or that society has no right to protect itself. Of course, dangerous people sometimes need to be separated from potential victims. Of course, behavior has to have consequences in a functional society. The question is not whether to respond to harmful behavior. The question is what the response is trying to accomplish, and what emotional register it operates in. Retributive punishment, the kind driven by the belief that the person deserves to suffer for their freely chosen wrong, accomplishes almost nothing measurable in terms of reducing future harmful behavior. The evidence on this is not ambiguous. Decades of criminological research show that the severity of punishment is a remarkably poor deterrent to crime. What actually reduces recidivism is access to education, mental health treatment, addiction support, stable housing, and economic opportunity. In other words, what reduces future harmful behavior is addressing the biological and environmental conditions that produce the behavior in the first place, which is exactly what a deterministic framework would predict. A system built on compassionate determinism would not ask, how much does this person deserve to suffer? It would ask, what produced this behavior and what can be changed? For some people, the answer is a great deal can be changed. Early intervention in childhood, reducing exposure to trauma, improving nutrition and environmental safety, providing stable caregiving can measurably alter the developmental trajectory of the prefrontal cortex and reduce the likelihood of later harmful behavior. This is not speculation. This is the outcome of longitudinal studies conducted over decades across multiple countries. The biology is plastic, especially early on, and it responds to conditions. For other people, the answer is that very little can be changed, at least not quickly. The damage is too deep, the risk too high, and separation from potential victims is genuinely necessary. But even in those cases, a deterministic framework insists that the separation be understood as tragic necessity rather than righteous punishment. We are not avenging a wrong. We are managing a biological reality. The difference in framing is not just philosophical. It has profound practical consequences for how institutions are designed, how people inside them are treated, and what the actual outcomes look like. Now, there is an objection that comes up reliably at this point in the argument, and it deserves a serious answer. The objection goes like this: if we accept determinism, If we stop holding people fully responsible for their behavior, won't people just stop trying? Won't the whole social fabric unravel? Won't everyone simply do whatever their biology inclines them toward, secure in the knowledge that they can't really be blamed? This objection is built on a misunderstanding of what determinism actually implies. The deterministic framework does not say that consequences don't shape behavior. Consequences absolutely shape behavior. That is precisely what the science shows. Reward and punishment are among the environmental inputs that influence the biological systems producing future behavior. The argument is not that consequences should be eliminated. The argument is that consequences should be calibrated to what actually works, which means they should be oriented toward changing future behavior rather than satisfying a retributive appetite for suffering. And here is the deeper irony. The belief in free will, the belief that people are solely responsible for their own outcomes, tends to produce less compassion and less effective intervention, not more. Studies consistently show that people who hold stronger beliefs in free will are more likely to support punitive responses to harmful behavior and less likely to support structural interventions addressing the environmental and biological conditions that produce that behavior. In other words, the free will belief makes us feel righteously angry, but acts as a practical obstacle to doing the things that would actually reduce harm. Determinism, properly understood, points in exactly the opposite direction. If behavior is the product of biology and environment, then the levers of change are biological and environmental. You invest in early childhood development. You treat addiction and mental illness as medical conditions. You reduce the structural stresses, poverty, inequality, discrimination, environmental toxins that compromise the neural architecture of millions of people before they ever make a single conscious decision. You build institutions that are oriented toward understanding and rehabilitation rather than suffering and retribution. None of this is soft. None of this is naive. It is, in fact, considerably more demanding than the retributive alternative, because it requires actually solving problems rather than just punishing people for them. It requires looking at the full causal chain rather than stopping at the convenient fiction of free choice. It requires sitting with the discomfort of not having someone to blame, of not getting the visceral satisfaction of righteous punishment, and redirecting that energy toward something that might actually work. There is a moment in the research on childhood adversity that has always seemed particularly worth dwelling on. Studies on the long-term neurological effects of early trauma show that children who experience chronic stress and abuse in the first few years of life show measurable differences in prefrontal cortex development, amygdala reactivity, and stress hormone regulation. Differences that persist into adulthood and that are associated with significantly elevated risks of depression, addiction, violence, and a range of other outcomes that we spend enormous social resources punishing rather than preventing. Those children did nothing. They were not yet capable of doing anything. The biology that will shape their behavior for the rest of their lives was being written in neural tissue before they had language, before they had memory, before they had any capacity whatsoever to influence the conditions they were developing inside. And yet we will spend decades responding to the downstream behavioral consequences of what happened to them in those early years, as if each consequence were a fresh free choice, deserving of fresh condemnation. The compassion that determinism makes available is not the soft, sentimental kind that looks away from harm and pretends everything is fine. It is the harder, clearer-eyed kind that looks directly at what is actually happening, at the full biological and environmental story of why people do what they do, and responds to that reality rather than to a flattering but false narrative about sovereign human freedom. It is the compassion of the cardiologist rather than the judge. It is the compassion that says, something went wrong here. Let's understand what it was and what can be done. It does not pretend the harm didn't happen. It does not pretend the behavior was acceptable. It simply refuses to add suffering to suffering in the name of a justice that the neuroscience suggests was never really on offer. And maybe that is the hardest thing about accepting the truth of determinism. Not the intellectual challenge of it, not the philosophical vertigo, but the emotional demand it makes. It asks you to give up something that feels very good, the clean, sharp satisfaction of justified blame, and replace it with something considerably more difficult. The long, complicated, unglamorous work of actually trying to understand and change the conditions that produce human suffering. That is not a small thing to ask. But then, the truth rarely is.